So, what I've been thinking about is civilization, the act of being civilized, you could say, and decivilization, the act of being decivilized. And if you look at the history of any society, what you see that lasts, that's a lasting society. What you see, but none of them last forever. First of all, we have to remember that. I mean, in terms of an idea of a nation or an idea of a political entity, none of them last forever. But what you see over the course of its history is a civilizing trend upwards, but it has troughs of decivilization where the Civil War would be an example in the United States. When you see, we may be heading to another one of those sorts of times. Um, and what you're going, so I think that instead of the progress of civilization being a 45-degree angle, like one of those Penrose diagrams, this, besides, instead of that, you have a trend upwards with numerous dips downwards, some big, some small. So you see that. So that's where I think we're heading. Uh, what's happening to the United States, I've said it before in another video, is that the administrative state, like a lot of administrative states in a lot of different societies, is becoming a metastasizing tumor, and it's going to be a net negative on the as an influence in the trend up the civilizing trend. So we are going to see this corruption intensify. It's already been going on. Really, I would say for 100 years, but we had some times when the administrative state was kind of flatlined in its growth for a while. But for the most part, and we've seen a few. I don't know if we've seen a period in the last 100 years where the administrative state was curtailed in any way. Maybe the 50s under Eisenhower. Certainly not under Reagan. Certainly not under any Republican supposed fiscal conservative since before Reagan. So I would say Eisenhower. Richard Nixon. I don't know. I'd have to look more into Richard Nixon. So, but we're heading into a state of the society where this administrative state has grown too big, it's too corrupt, and it's going to be a net negative for the country. And how this plays out, I think, is that this administrative state will continue to delegitimize itself. And when I say the administrative state, I basically mean everything in the Beltway of Washington, D.C., and all the little satellite cells of federal government. And we will see states start going different directions in terms of policy. We're actually going to see a decentralization brought about by the delegitimization of the federal government as a viable political entity. It'll probably still exist through all of this, but it will become more and more of a joke, which it already is. And we'll see, I believe, under the current, what I don't see, thank God, is someone who can really, a personality who can bring the various factions of what we would call the left, which includes most of the administrative state, under cohesion in a way that would increase their organization. There's no strong leaders there, and so it's going to continue to fragment. And the administrative state is just going to start doing whatever it wants, and people are going to stop respecting it. And bottom line is, once a political entity loses the legitimacy from the, so you can either use fear, which would take a strong personality to execute a strong leader, or it will either use fear, or it will descend into, they will try, it'll just lose its legitimacy because it'll continue to be as corrupt, if not more corrupt, as long as people don't get held accountable for like what happened under the Russiagate investigation, lying us into war over and over again. If people don't get held accountable for that, it's gonna get worse. Okay, but in the process, they're going to destroy their legitimacy, and without the people's without the people's belief in a government, that government is illegitimate and it will no longer be effective. Whether it exists or not, it will lose its effectiveness. When people stop respecting their government, there's nothing a government can do about it. There is nothing except use fear, which I can't rule out. That would be the worst thing, probably one of the worst, most tragic chapters in the history of the world, if that were to happen. I thank God that there is nobody strong enough and brutal enough, because they have to be strong and brutal to really take the role of like a Stalin, for example. See, Stalin inherited a new regime that was already falling apart, and basically he fixed it by killing half of the government workers, a third of the officers, making them disappear. Anybody who disagreed, committing genocide of the rebellious Ukrainians. Okay, without that sort of brutality, Russia would have been a failed experiment of a state. You could say what you want about Stalin. Okay, so that's what's going to happen as this government becomes more and more corrupt. It's just so big. The actors involved are too self-interested, too brazenly corrupt. The good people that there are just keeping their heads down. The ambitious ones, and usually the more corrupt ones, rise up to the top. But it's a broken machine at the end of the day, and I don't think it can last. And it will lose the full faith of the people. And then what we will see is they'll go around wagging their finger and barking their tail, but it's just going to get more and more to the point where they're no longer actually serving a purpose. And the states, of course, the various states will do their own thing to a greater extent. And that's a good thing if that happens. That's a good thing. And I think that's really progress in that respect. Because once we get to a point where the states can coexist under a less centralized form of government and everything works, okay, I think that will be what I think it already is the thing that set this country apart from the rest of the world. While I'm not an American exceptionalist, I do believe that the American form of government, not because of not because of what happens in D.C., but the baked-in part of decentralization, I think, may set this country apart from so many other failed experiments. It's already been a blessing and a curse. You have the Civil War. This part of that, besides slavery, was over states' rights. You can now, if you ask the average Civil War soldier at the time, the Confederate soldier, what at the time, because we know this, because this is what they were writing in their letters. The ones that can read and write, that is. From what I understand, most of them weren't taking part in the Civil War, fighting for the Confederacy because of slavery. Most of these soldiers didn't own slaves. Most of them didn't give a fuck about. They never will own slaves. They didn't really give a fuck. But of course, they did approve of the institution enough to fight for the Confederacy. Let's be honest, okay? But if you would have asked them, they would have said, "No, we're here because of our right of our state to live however the F we want." And that was kind of a founding principle of the country, and it's what's made this country so unique in so many ways. But it was a curse in that instance because you had too many people that even just approved of the institution of slavery solely because they felt that even if it's abhorrent, they felt that it's none of y'all's business and let us do what we want and that kind of thing. And so it's a blessing and a curse, but I think it could save us from becoming another failed experiment.